First of all, my name is Ben, as has been said, and I am a community organizer. And my trip to get here is when I was in college. I went on a trip to Mexico and Costa Rica. And I did not have any greater theological or political agenda. There was some folks in my high school, and I wanted to hang out with them for the summer and got a free trip to Central America and had no expectations to do anything more than have fun on the beach. And while I was there, I had an experience that social scientists would say it was a transformational, a radicalizing experience. I experienced something that they call cognitive dissonance. And this is that type of experience where the reality you're experiencing doesn't align with your perception of reality. I had grown up, I imagine, like many students at George Washington, suburban white guy, wrestler, football player, Boy Scout, probably going to go to a liberal arts college like University of Richmond and more than likely end up a lawyer and MBA. And when I was in Central America, I was confronted with a reality that was very different than what the executive branch said. What I heard the president say, the Secretary of State, and what the news media said, and frequently what my university professors were saying. And so I became very interested in how to engage in transformational development. Now, as a community organizer, our thing is organizing for change and organizing power. And power can take lots of different forms. You can have, for example, economic power. So we can see in our elections how money has a big influence on our political system. You can have military power. And if we look at electoral politics, for example, a big part of the effort is to get enough people to vote for a particular person or a particular party to where you have the numbers to affect change. So in our work, we have a spectrum of places that people are at, moving from sympathizer to organizer. And something I think is important to say is that it's not like any of these positions are better, and we're all simultaneously occupying one of these spaces. Because unfortunately, there's so many things to deal with on the planet that it's really hard for any of us to be an organizer on every single issue there is. So a sympathizer is somebody who isn't actively against what you're doing, doesn't want to do you harm, but they're not engaged in any activity for realizing the objective that you have. An activist is somebody who might vote, might donate, might show up to a protest, but they're not necessarily organizing anything. And an organizer is like Will or Madison. Madison is an organizer, spends most of her time dealing with client relations service, relations software, and connecting with Will and making sure that Audi and I get the link for tonight's presentation, that I remember to be here. So organizing is a lot about structuring, planning, and working for a change. And a big part of organizing is having what we call a theory of change. You see, and a theory of change is just something that basically, very simply says, what is a theory of change? A model that demonstrates how stakeholders expect to attain a commonly understood long-term goal. And one of the things you do as a community organizer is this little exercise called a problem tree. And a problem tree is like you've got fruits and leaves and branches and roots. Frequently, we only address consequences. And so what an example of this is like our program of building stoves. Now, we first encountered the concept of building stoves when we were doing ambulatory health programs for rural communities. We were visiting health clinics in communities that had no health coverage. And we encountered upper respiratory infections over and over and over again. And I didn't know at the time, but the primary cause of mortality for women in the developing world, greater than AIDS, typhoid, and malaria combined, are the illnesses linked to upper respiratory infections. And when we did studies, we frequently found more men over the age of 50 than women. So quite literally, cooking on open pit fires in unventilated houses was killing the women. Now, one solution would be to build a stove. One solution would be to build a clinic and hand out pharmaceuticals, antibiotics every 3 months. But you see there, you're treating a consequence, which is the infection, but you're not addressing the root cause. So a theory of change is also about identifying and establishing what exactly it is you're working for. So all of our program laid out here in this theory of change in Guatemala with the Association of Highland Women. This is the theory of change underlying our programming with the Association of Highland Women. And the point of this program is civically and economically empowered, resilient women in the Western Highlands of Guatemala. Now, there were some particular issues that the women were confronting when this program initiated. One is that the Guatemalan military had deployed a campaign of terror against the population. A campaign of terror is more than just like a counterinsurgency campaign where you're fighting a war. A campaign of terror is similar or the same type of thing that the KKK did in the United States during the Jim Crow years. This is to terrorize the population into political and social immobility, to make people terrified to meet, terrified to vote, terrified to speak their thoughts. And so things like my wife found her uncle's body decapitated on the side of the road. The army would come in and open up women and remove a fetus and bang it against a tree. Types of activities that leaves the population traumatized and terrorized. Additionally, for the 500 years, in many communities, a cultural norm had developed to where indigenous girls did not leave their family compound because Hispanic men had liberty with indigenous bodies. And so there was no legal repercussions, there was no social repercussions. So one of the cultural norms was to keep girls protected and in the family compound. Now, with the violence and leading to today with the mass migration, you have regions that are populated entirely by women or predominantly by women. And women are being forced into new roles in the community, into new entrepreneurial roles, wage earning, cash earning roles, management, leadership roles, decision-making roles. But for a period of history, there hasn't been the cultural organizational formation for women to assume these roles. So actually, this whole model was part of bringing women from Guatemala to the United States in an effort to rebuild housing for widows. One of the things with the Guatemalan military's campaign was what they call scorched earth, when they go in, they burn down all the houses and cornfields. And so we were engaged in an effort to assist women to rebuild their houses. And the women came to the United States and visited some of the women's groups that we relate to, like United Methodist Women's Circles. And the women from Guatemala were like, whoa, this is like, in this model, you've got mutual support. You've got a type of behavioral health program where people are sharing. It's called Roses and Thorns. What's happened this week that's made me sad? What's something positive? They saw leadership with a president, a treasurer. They saw engagement over learning new skills and information about the world, such as bringing in speakers from Guatemala to learn about the way the world is. And so these women saw this empowerment process. And for us, that is the critical thing. It is this word agency. And agency is a form of power. Philosophically, agency is the ability of somebody to identify a desire and have the capacity in order to realize that thing that they dream. And we are interested in a particular context. In social sciences, a lot of times you hear the word structure bantered around. And structure is a form of process. Other words for structure is like the suburbs or the ghetto or Appalachia. So you can think of a particular socioeconomic political structure. And the thing with processes is processes produce predictable results. It's like potatoes. You can make French fries, hash browns, mashed potatoes, stick some cheese on it called creme brulee. The thing is the potato stays the same. It's the process that produces a predictable result. So throughout the Americas, there is a context, which is highland communities in Bolivia, Ecuador, Peru, Guatemala, Southwest United States, Arizona, Montana. You have indigenous populations that also share the lowest quality of life indexes of any population in the Western Hemisphere. Lowest birth rate, highest suicide rate, infant mortality, quality of life indexes such as this. And these communities, the structure is something that is known as settler colonialism. Now, we can understand one form of colonialism like India, where the British controlled the state, controlled the population, and extracted resources. But the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Guatemala, much of the Americas, you have a different form of colonialism, which is called settler colonialism. And in settler colonialism, the purpose of the process is the elimination of the indigenous population to gain access to their lands. And so the English didn't come to the Americas in order to develop trade relationships. The English came over here to take the Americas. One way of saying it that I think is kind of handy is differentiating between an immigrant and a settler. An immigrant goes to another land and typically endeavors to learn the language, obey the laws of that land, and incorporate them into the culture of the country they're immigrating to. A settler comes in order to eliminate the indigenous population and to impose a new way of living, a new language, a new form of existence. And so there are different tools or techniques used to control and eliminate a population. One of these is dependency, and dependency as a structure. An example of dependency in the continental United States was, for example, like the buffalo, the herds of buffalo. A lot of North Americans kind of imagined that the indigenous population just sort of melted away to this manifest destiny of a woman on a shell riding through on lights. But actually, the indigenous population put up quite a vigorous military opposition to the conquest. And up until the 1880s, you had New York City, the East Coast going into Ohio, and you had California. And you had a vast land in between these two coasts, from the Canadian border to the Mexican border, with a whole lot of people that were not particularly keen to the idea of living in a concentration camp. And what you have to realize is that it costs the United States government something like $1.5 million a day to try to control the indigenous population militarily. If you watch movies like Dances with Wolves or Geronimo, you see the soldiers, so obviously you have their salaries. You also have all those horses. You've got all the hay to feed those horses. You've got the veterinarians and the physicians to take care of the soldiers and the horses. You've got the military bases. So it was an extremely expensive endeavor to try to militarily control the indigenous population. So what General Sherman did under President Grant was to have the idea that if we eliminate the buffalo, we eliminate the food source, and then the people have to wait in line where we tell them to wait in line to feed them. By controlling their food, we control the population, we control their movement. So this level of dependency went throughout. Don Audi talked about culture in meeting your basic needs. And so through this, everything from speaking on the most intimate personal level, speaking to the creator, you had to go through a white European priest in a foreign language talking to a foreign god, to education, to business. Even throughout the Americas, organizational structures like indigenous political systems, community organizations were prohibited by the government and repressed for the purpose of creating a structure of dependency in order to control a population. Now, for us, we seek to endeavor to engage in questioning and searching for transformational models of intercultural communication and work. Because obviously we are all sharing one planet and we are sharing one hemisphere, and we need to learn to work together. And one of the things we're interested in is how do nonprofits, university service learning groups, church agencies, how do they perpetuate dependency, thereby participating in settler colonialism and sustaining settler colonialism rather than transforming it? So in community organizing, we sort of divide the work up into 4 different broad categories. One is called service provision. That's what many of us are most familiar with when we think of nonprofit work. That's when when someone gives something to somebody else, like providing housing, food, clothing, education, build a school, build a clinic. But look at the dynamics there, both semiotically, both psychologically, as well as financially. In this model, if I'm doing a social service provision organization, I, as a powerful white male that history has privileged, I get more resources to manage, and I get to take a percentage of those resources, which helps me. And psychologically, I get to feel good about myself. I get to feel like I come from a good society, we're good people, and we're helping these poor people who are desperate, who can't help themselves. And so if you can visualize a relationship of power, the service provision model, if not done correctly, rather than transforming conditions of oppression, oppression is when somebody does not have sufficient means to meet their own needs. Rather than transforming conditions of oppression, it is perpetuating oppression. The second model is called advocacy, and that's when typically someone like me speaks to people, other people like me, saying, hey, we need to change this policy. But again, it is I, with my understanding of reality and the way the world is, talking about changing the structures that have been imposed. And again, there's no transformation. The third is this term development, and as Don Audi very eloquently stated, what does the word development mean? Whose perception, whose goals, whose theory of change? Because there are different theories of change. So, for example, with development, for dealing with housing, for example, a lot of us are familiar with redlining. That's when the United States government, during the 1930s with the New Deal, you had this program of providing mortgages. It was the first time, and it was meant to create wealth. And the government redlined neighborhoods of people of color. And so they were not eligible for these mortgages or insurances. So the result of this was that white communities increased their wealth and had a structure of wealth creation that people of color were denied. Now today, especially after 2008, which many people call reverse redlining, you have conditions of homelessness and housing scarcity. One type of development is to build housing projects owned by people from the suburbs, and that the government give poor people vouchers in order to pay the people from the suburbs who have the money to build the projects rent. If you see there, that is just perpetuating a system in which those that have already been privileged continue to be privileged, and those that have been marginalized continue to be marginalized. And so in development, there's a type that's called community development, where you seek, for example, to form a housing co-op where the members in the community get the asset, the government's helping them to have their own house and therefore build wealth, as well as assisting them to create the organizational structure in the community. And the fourth part is organizing, which is we do. And organizing is about communicating and getting people, identifying an objective and working together. So our objective is transformation, liberation, to disrupt the system of settler colonialism. And more importantly, or most importantly, to promote the words from like Don Aldi, to realize that we need to do what, sorry to use a big word, but an epistemological transformation. That our generation, as another compañero from Guatemala says, the 21st century will either be a century of love, we will cease to exist. So the type of culture, the type of systems we've had are not adequate for the type of world we are living in today and the conditions we have. So what is required is actually a very profound transformation, not just a transformation of like socialism to capitalism. We actually need to use university words and ontological and axiological and epistemological transformation. We need to change our belief systems, our values, and what we actually, how we view reality and establish authority. I hope I have been somewhat coherent. It's really hard to shrink down. I tried to touch the big points without, fully elaborating. So I hope it is coherent what I just said.